is the geometry of, sorry, I'm being interrupted by the recording notice, the geometry of these gardens. Everything is in straight lines, they're squares or rectangles. Even the water here is a geometric shape. When in garden history terms, when water is sort of long and narrow like this, we call it a canal. Well, clearly it's not an industrial canal, so it's sort of quite a specific term. The other thing to notice is that we've got, coming from the house, coming towards us, we've got this long axis. Now I hope you can see my cursor, because I haven't managed to pick up the pointer for this. So I'm sorry about that. I hope you can see the cursor going to and fro across the screen. So a long axis coming towards us here. There are also cross axes made up by the garden itself, the canalized river going across it, and another one with the terrace that we can't see. And it's these features that are so characteristic of gardens at this time, in around 1700. And geometric shapes in gardens had been the prevailing style for about the past 200 years. So it had become sort of quite regimented by 1700. So I'm going to have to move on to the next slide. What's going on here?
If you take your cursor up to where the slideshow is, you will need to click on it once to make it think that you're clicking on the slideshow. That may help.
You mean new share?
No, on your presentation itself, not on Zoom.
Right, I've only got the commands at the top.
You need to be in PowerPoint.
Okay, let's see. Oh, there we are. Yeah, sorry about that.
Perfect.
Okay. Yep, there we are. Oh, panic over. By the second half of the 18th century, the landscape of Bowood looked much like this. And I think you'll agree it's a complete contrast to what we saw in the previous picture. For a start, there's not a straight line in sight. We've got this large body of irregular water here. And so it's completely different about 50 years later. So these two places, Bowood and Whetham, I'm sure most of you know, lie just to the east of Calne. So this is Calne up here. And they're mainly within this triangle of roads here. The Whetham estate occupies this area down in the bottom right of that triangle. And most of the rest of the land within that triangle belonged to Bowood at one time or another. In 1700, most big houses on big estates looked like this, or similar to this. So this is Babington in Gloucestershire, from a painting of around 1699. You can see the geometric walled gardens here. You can see avenues stretching out into the landscape in all directions. And those avenues form centered on the house itself. So there's an axis going straight away from the house and at angles from it as well. So looking at the detail a little bit more, this is the house here. So I'm looking at the colored version now. And you probably can just see the church there. It's very, very close to the house, as you probably know. And in the later 18th century, that church was moved about 10 feet to the right. I don't know why, probably because to do with the view from the house. In front of the house, you've got a walled garden, and then you've got other walled areas. This looks like the kitchen garden here. There's a dovecote, there are stables, and there's a horse pond, which is still there today. And on this lawn, or lawned, we've got the laundry drying. The other thing to notice particularly is that the water that we can see in the painting has also been made geometric. It's in squares or rectangles. So a very geometric set out. I think this place, which is Margam Abbey near Port Talbot, again, a painting from around 1700, is perhaps a little bit more what Whetham might have looked like. We've got the house here and the stables in the background here. We've got geometric gardens which are walled, and the fish ponds proudly displayed in front of the house with some rather lovely little gates giving access into them. And I think you'll be able to pick up pretty easily that, again, we've got a strong axis coming down from the house towards us here, emphasized by the avenues of trees that we've got. I'm labouring this point about the geometry and the axial nature of these landscapes, because what came later was just so different. So I want you to be aware of the contrast. Now at Whetham, the family there in 1700 was John Curl Ernley, and he had inherited in 1697. But going back centuries, the family name had been Finamore, and they'd held land there since probably the 13th century. Now, this is a delightful little painting of Whetham, but from 1844. So it's much, much later than the time we're talking about. But I thought it would give you an impression of what the house looked like and what the lie of the land is. So we've got a gabled house here, and there's a little porch here. So just notice the porch. We'll come back to that later. The land drops down, as you can see, to what is a pond here. I slightly feel that this drop has been exaggerated, but perhaps it hasn't. So although we haven't got a painting of Whetham in around 1700, we do actually have a good idea of what the landscape was like at the beginning of the 18th century. And like Longleat, it was geometric in character. So I've gone back to the pictures of Longleat because I want you to hold this idea of the axial landscape in your minds. This is an engraving from a book of engravings by two people called Niff and Kip, which they produced in 1707. And they produced about 60 of these engravings of the big houses and estates in the country. So we've got Longleat House here. You've got the geometric gardens here, the axes stretching away through the landscape. You've got the river, which has been canalised here, and where it goes out of the actual gardens, it's been very correct and falling into square ponds here. This kind of view, which is as if you were sort of up in a hot air balloon, is called a topographical view or a bird's eye view. And it does give a very good idea of the layout of gardens and landscapes at the time. So you can see the plan of the landscape quite clearly, and you get some idea of what the topography is like. The only thing is that in the area where the gardens are, the artists, in this case, they tend to flatten out everything, and you just, if you visit these landscapes, you expect it to be completely flat because that's what you've seen in the engraving, and of course they're not. I'll come back to that point again later on. So, although we don't have a painting of Whetham, we do have two things which give us a very good idea about the landscape. One is a tithing map of 1728, and the other is John Curlernely's diary of 1712, describing what he's doing in the landscape. This is the 1728 map. Now, don't panic if you can't really see anything on it, because I'll show you details of it in a minute. But I just wanted you to see the context of the Whetham estate. So this is the Whetham estate around here. Whetham House is here. A very important thing to notice is the Whetham Brook coming up here and continuing and out into the neighbouring estate. So Calne is off to the right. Along the top, we've got Bowood Estate. Down the bottom, we've got Headington Parish. Over to the left, we've got Chittow and Spy Park. And coming up here, where the cursor is the main Devizes to Chippenham Road. And in this top left area, we've got Sandy Lane. What we haven't got is the main road from Calne, meeting with the Devizes Road. And those of you who know it will note it comes down here, goes into a sort of crook and a bend here and a deep hollow, and follows this line here. Now, to get to Whetham House, there were two possibilities. One is coming in, well, they both come off the road on the left here, coming along here and going up to the front of the house. And a second possibility is from the top of Sandy Lane near the pub called the George, along here, and at a crossroads here known as Cuff's Corner, down here and into the back way of the house there. Now, if you can remember Cuff's Corner, it will turn up again later. The other things to notice, I think, are that the landscape is very axial. It's laid out on a north-south basis. And we've got the pond here, which was a mill pond. So here we can see the map in a bit more detail, and you'll be able to spot the house and the stables here. There's a turning circle in front of the house. There's a walk leading to the park here, and there's the mill pond there with the mill building here. So in garden history, you need a good imagination. So I hope you're fiercely imagining all these things here. This rectangular space is the best garden. That's what's written on the map there. And it was walled. So quite similar to that one in the front of Badminton. This is Whetham House today. And I think you can recognize the gables here. And there's the little porch that I mentioned. It's also acquired a roof as well. And I think later in the 19th century, there was an extension here. What I want you to notice in these two photographs is the slope, the lie of the land. There's a slope coming down here, then it flattens out. It continues, obviously, in this photograph. It drops again, and the mill pond is down there. And that, this flat area along here is the walk that we saw labelled in the previous slide. So I'm going to look at these areas in a little bit more detail and tell you about them. We've got the house up here, as you know, and here's that walk that I was telling you about. leading to what looks like a sort of an amphitheatre shape here. Now, this goes back to the point I was making earlier about those engravings making everything seem flat. And it's the same with maps. This, you would imagine, is a flat walk from the house to this area of land here. But that's not the case at all. The walk was level for some way. Then it goes into a deep dip here, and you have to climb up to get to this area here. And those of you who know the road from Calne to the Devizes Road will know that you go into a bend, and the dip here is very shady, and then you climb out of it as you go on. So you come up that walk from the park, from the house to the park, and you reach this area of land, which is all quite flat and open. And you continue down this walk here, which is called Park Walk. As you are walking down there, you've got fields on either side of you. They might have been arable, they might have been pasture. And this is really very interesting because it was quite unusual to have anything functional or agricultural in a designed landscape at this time. And it suggests the influence of a man called Stephen Switzer. He was a landscape gardener and a nurseryman and a writer in the early years of the 18th century. And in his writings, he developed a concept which he called rural and extensive gardening. And this was his idea that the productive part of your landscape was worth admiring, was worth looking at, and should be linked to the designed part of your landscape. So that's why you've got this walk and pasture or arable on either side of it. It was a real novelty, this idea, at the time. Switzer probably advised John Calne on laying out this landscape at Whetham, because he mentions John and Whetham in his writings several times, and he also had a nursery in or near Devizes. So the park walk, if that's where we've gone, leads down to this area at the bottom of the map, which is labelled gardens and ponds. And in the winter, there are still ponds there today. I think they were probably the original estate fish ponds. But they've been designated gardens and ponds, so they've probably been beautified, and this would be your destination as you're walking down here. What you've got here is a beautiful geometric shape of which there is absolutely no trace on the ground today. There isn't any trace of it in aerial photographs either. And it's labelled part of the park called the Ring. We've no idea what this is at all. The only time I've come across something like this was in another plan that Switzer did for Nostell Park, where there was a circular area in front of the house and he called it the Ring. It's possible that it was just an area of grass that was kept really short, and you could perhaps come from the house in a carriage or dog cart down here and drive to it, and obviously you'd be able to turn around and go back, and probably have al fresco entertainment with your friends here and go and look at the water gardens here. But as I say, there's absolutely no trace of it on the ground today. So it is a mystery. It's also very large. It's over 4 acres. So perhaps the cynic in me would say it was so that they could take more land out of owing tithes on. Looking towards the north of the house now, we can see that that axis continues. And what we've got here are grass plats, we've got woods. This says a coppice wood here. This is a walk going through the woods. And we've got a cross axis here and a cross axis forming here. There's a pond here, and there's a grove, a special arrangement of planted trees here. Just bear in mind that you've got the brook here, because naturally the land goes up from the brook on either side. And looking to the left of this pond, we've got another area here labelled a pond and waterworks. Now, I don't know that you'll be able to read the writing, but you have to take my word for it. And there's another little pond here. We've also got a side stream coming in here, which will eventually, of course, join the Whetham Brook. Here, there's a building of some sort, and just behind it is a small little circle. So what we've got, in fact, is a pond with a cascade coming down it. So this is obviously on rising ground here, and the cascade is falling down to this pond here, and then will find its way into the river. Beyond this, on this side, we've got another pond here, and dropping down to the smaller scale map in the bottom right-hand corner, you can just about make out that building that I mentioned there. You can see the side stream, and that's got a couple of ponds going along it as well. And what you've got going from this pond here, a dotted line called a water carriage to this pond here. So if I go back to the larger scale map, the dotted line is coming in here from that reservoir pond off to the left, and it's filling a pond here. And I think the reason for this, a water carriage, by the way, is a narrow little ditch, if you like, to take water from one place to another. The reason for this is to power these waterworks here. This building is a cascade house. I'll come back to that in a moment. This area along where the water carriage is was probably an area of ornamental walks, and you can still see very large overgrown box plants there even now. So this building, we know, was a cascade building because John Calne mentions it in his diary. Before he started designing this landscape at Whetham, he went on a fact-finding tour to Northamptonshire, where he stayed with his sister at Pytchley. And he went around visiting the big houses in that area, places like Castle Ashby and Burley on the Hill and Cransley Hall, noting down the features that he was interested in and the measurements. So, for example, the measurements of a terrace, for example, the length and the width of it. People were really quite obsessed with measurements in those days, I think. This is an extract from his diary. And the first entry that I've highlighted here is Tuesday, the 6th of May. And for this entry, he says, "Fine day enough. Removed the great head at the cascade into the arch with much labour and difficulty." Now, we're not exactly sure what the head is, but it may well refer to the fountain. Then on the 7th of May, that's that entry there, here he says he's thanking God that he's reached his 30th birthday. And he threw a big party in his garden to celebrate that. He says, "Weather exceeding fine all day. 70 neighbours dined here, and the poor people relieved, who dined in the great walk of the wilderness and walked about it with the music." So it sounds a really lovely day. A wilderness is an area of trees that have been planted, but that have straight walks laid out through the trees, and the walks have hedges sort of delineating them. Later in his diary, he says, "The glass into the door at the cascade, which came Saturday night, 3 squares broken. So we can tell, we know that he's putting glass into doors in the Cascade House. If it wasn't for that entry, we might not know that it was big enough to have doors. And there is a slight possibility that the glass might have been mirrored glass. We think, we're fairly certain, that the Cascade House was very much like this. This is an engraving from a book that Switzer wrote, and I think you'll be able to see that there's a building, stone building, which is sort of semicircular in shape here. There are hills at the back which are just fictional. They don't relate to our setting at all. This is a fountain, and there are various statues on the roof, as well as in niches and so on here. You've also got various people setting the scene, which I think we can ignore. And Switzer was something of an expert in constructing waterworks. And he mentions both, as I said, Whetham, but also neighbouring Spy Park in his writings. And he says, "My late good friend, John Curl-Ernley at Sandy Lane, Wiltshire, has a design at the head of his long cascade, much like this," he's referring to this engraving, "which has, in the opinion of a good many judges, a very good effect from the bottom of it, only the cascade is too narrow." Now, Switzer's been quite honest. He says it's not his design. He attributes it to someone called Lepultre. But with this semicircular building, I think you can agree that it is obviously similar to the footprint of that building that we saw on the map. Elsewhere in his writings, he also says that the trees overshadow it too much. Now, I love this little sketch. It's not mine. It came from my friend Bill Brogden, who is the world expert on Stephen Switzer. And you can see he did it very quickly. He did it on some recycled paper. But I think it's got such life in it, and it tells us a lot about what this cascade looked like and helps us with our imaginings. It's pretty accurate, I think, because when Bill was researching in the library at Hopetown House near Edinburgh, he came across a description written by Lord Hopetown of his visit to Whetham in 1712. And Hopetown described what the cascade looked like with detailed measurements. And you can see that Bill's written in measurements at various places here. The one across here, the width of the cascade, I think says 7 feet. So using that plate, that engraving that Switzer put in his book, and using this description by Lord Hopetown, we can make a fairly good guess that this is what John's cascade and waterworks looked like. The semicircular stone cascade building, statues on the roof, a pond with a fountain, and apparently the fountain was in the shape of a dolphin. So the water would come out into the pond, out of the pond, down the cascade, which apparently had steps in it. So then a flattish area, more steps, another flattish area, and going on to that little pond that we saw in the north-south axis. And in that pond, there were 3 horses' heads making the fountains. Hopetown also mentioned that there was moss on the roof, which is quite interesting because it seems to link back to what Switzer was saying about the trees overshadowing it too much. Nothing is left of this cascade building and the cascade today, which has got to be quite unusual in my experience, because very often, you know, you turn up to somewhere where you know there was something quite significant, and you'd find the odd stone perhaps to sort of reassure you. But in this area here at Whetham, there is absolutely nothing but earth and grass and leaves. And I think that the explanation for this is probably a family tragedy, because John Calne died very young in 1725. He was in his early 40s, and he only had one daughter, Constantia. I think she only had one child, John's grandson, and that little boy died when he was about a year old. And there's a monument to him in the north aisle of Calne Church, and I always look at it when I go to carol services there. His daughter Constantia died in 1753. In the estate accounts, I think for the 1750s, there is an entry for the sale of stone. And I have a strong feeling that this cascade building was taken down, and whatever the cascade was made of, and that it was sold off. This sort of builds up the picture that the person who inherited the estate, who was the son of a cousin, he was James Money of Muchmarken in Herefordshire, and the Moneys of Muchmarken were a prestigious family. Possibly he was an absentee landlord, which would explain why this was all sold off, if that's actually the case. And later on, in the early 1790s, William Money, who had inherited the estate, was part of the Turnpike Trust, which built the road between Calne and the Devizes Road today. Elaborate waterworks like these and the geometric layout of gardens that we've looked at were the height of fashion in the early 18th century. And those of you who know Durham Park may also know that there was a big cascade there at about the same time. So where you park the car, as you start to walk down that hill, that's where the cascade ran down. By the middle of the 18th century, landscape fashion had changed completely, and many landscapes looked like this one at Bowood. This is the Badminton, and we remember the walled gardens and the axes extending into the landscape. There are no walled gardens here. There are no avenues. There are no straight lines at all. And it's not axial in any way. I'll show you maps of it later. There is a very large area of irregular water here. And those things that I've mentioned, or the absence of those things, sum up the changes in landscape style at this time. I mean, that's a simplification, of course, but it's quite a good summary. This is a painting of Bowood in about 1725. And you'll see that it's a topographical view, rather like the one of Margam Abbey and the engraving I showed you of Longleat. It was owned by Sir Orlando Bridgeman at this time. This is the house. These are the stables. This is a turning circle in front of the house. And you've got the geometric walled gardens that we're now becoming so familiar with. In addition to that, you've got avenues that have been planted going off into the landscape and coming towards us, creating this very strong axis. I think the wilderness is probably here. It's quite a naive painting, this, isn't it? The artist clearly struggled with a perspective. There's a gate that appears to have fallen over here, and I'm quite sure it hadn't. And the other gates that are facing us, he's been able to cope with a lot better. But as I said, this topographical view does give us quite a lot of information as we look at it. And it's been tipped up enough that we can see the fish ponds in the distance, which have been made geometric. And the owner would have been proud of these fish ponds. They were status symbols. here there is a mound with some trees on it, and that I think still endures today. There is a little mound at Bowood with some trees on it. I think that's probably the same one. The water has been made rigidly geometric, as we would expect. Calne, of course, is off to the right-hand side, and I think you can just see Calne Tower there. However, we have to bear in mind that what people want to show us in their paintings of their wonderful houses and landscapes is not always what was there. And this does also apply to maps as well, sometimes. This is an estate map of Bowood in 1763. And because it's not always easy to see all the detail on this map, I have drawn a diagram of it here. And this is the house, and these are the stables here. In 1754, Bowood Estate was bought by John Petty Fitzmaurice, the first Earl of Shelburne. And sales particulars for the estate say that the house was incomplete. It didn't have a staircase. It mentions gardens partly walled, an orchard, a dove house, a wilderness, I think here, cascades, I don't know where they are, a reservoir stocked with fish, almost certainly this pond here that we saw in the painting, and a small warren. We've also got the avenues that we could see in the painting, and the mound is indicated there. That's here on the map. You will also, I'm sure, have noticed that the water, which we saw as a beautiful rectangle, isn't a rectangle at all here. Now, it could have been altered, but I think that's unlikely. Those of you who know Bowood will know that from the house, the land drops down to the lake quite significantly. And it would have required a lot more labour to dig into the rising ground on that side. And it's quite possible that they decided that it was just too much labour and therefore too much expense. The first Earl died in 1761, and his widow commissioned a lovely mausoleum from Robert Adam. And in 1762, the second Earl of Shelburne signed a contract with Lancelot Capability Brown, who produced a plan for the landscape in 1763. This is that plan, and I've rotated it so that north is at the top. Now, don't worry if you can't really see what's on this plan, because I'll talk about it and I'll show you a slightly clearer interpretation in a minute. But basically, the big house is here. You've got the lake here. And in the half century that has elapsed between that painting of Bowood that we saw and this plan that's being made, a lot has changed. Brown sweeps away the formal walled gardens here. He breaks up the avenues by felling some of the trees and adding extra trees so you can't tell that they're avenues anymore. You've got this large area of irregular water, and you've got perimeter belts being planted of trees around the estate to screen it from the public, with sort of meandering drives and rides going through it. Coming up from the south is our friend the Whetham Brook, and that's what Brown dammed here to make the lake. This is a photograph from Country Life from the 1930s, and I think it gives quite a good idea of what the estate looked like as Brown laid it out. The only thing I would say is that the terraces that you can see at this point were not there. Brown had nothing to do with those, and they were much later. So this is the big house that was pulled down in 1955. We've got parkland here with beautiful trees, quite a lot of them specimen trees, the lake down here, the kitchen garden at the back here, the stables and estate offices here, and pleasure grounds round here. Across here, we've got a new bit. You might remember the diagram on the couple of slides back, which just showed a sort of an E shape here. Now, commissioned by the second Earl, Sir Robert Adam has designed a new range to screen off and sort of beautify that functional area there. I used the word pleasure grounds just now, and that is a garden history term that suggests usually a fairly intimate area, reasonably near the house often, planted with trees and flowering shrubs and with meandering walks going through it. I often associate it with being for sort of use for the ladies really, because the chances are if the men wanted exercise, they'd go off hunting. This range designed by Robert Adam was known as the Diocletian wing and was really a series of greenhouses which were structures for storing and protecting your tender evergreens over the winter. Here is a view of it, which I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, across the front of the house with the main house on the right here. We know that the lake was filled in 1766 because Lady Shelburne wrote about it in her diary, and she was so pleased to get rid of the morass of mud that had been everywhere for months and months. Here in the bottom right is where the big house stood, and this would have been their view down the lake. This is Ferryman's cottage here. You might just be able to pick out the ha-ha going across here. This shows us the dam that Capability Brown built, and I always think of his dams and this one being straight, but quite clearly it's not. It's quite curved, isn't it? And there are sluice gates here to control the flow of water out of the lake. This is the Doric Temple, and it was not in that site when Brown laid out the landscape. It wasn't put there until the next century, until the mid-19th century. We don't know where it came from, although somewhere in the pleasure grounds is thought to be the answer, and we don't know who designed it. Personally, I think it was probably Brown who designed it, because he was a competent architect. He designed a number of houses and all sorts of structures. And this is very attractive in its site where it sits, but fairly plain, shall we say. Very much unlike this architecture of Robert Adam here. So to make this landscape, as I've mentioned, Brown had two Whetham which was found up here from Whetham, and here's House Corner that I talked about earlier. So Whetham, bottom of the slide. So Brown downs the up here and creates this 14-hectare lake here. The original boundary of this estate largely followed the line of that brook. There was a slight bulge here. So in order to create some of these features, extra land had to be bought from the people who owned it. Some of it from Whetham, some from other landowners. Because what Brown planned was to push his approach drive coming along here and going up to the house here. So this is the one coming from Calne, over here where the writing is. And initially, Lord Shelburne didn't own that land, and it had to be bought. They also needed a bit more on this side, so that when the lake flooded, it on their land and not anyone else's. Originally, the road came up to the right here, and then turned right and went off up to Calne. And just before that, there was a hamlet just there. Now, obviously, that didn't serve. And I suspect that those people were moved into purpose-built cottages in Sandy Lane. Some of you will know those lovely stone thatch cottages that are there, which all look of a similar style. And they remind me of an estate that Brown designed for Milton Abbey in Dorset, although the cottages are rendered there, but they're the same shape and size. So I wonder if Brown designed a sort of a little estate in Sandy Lane for people in that hamlet. We've also got famous cottage here, as I mentioned, and that's because the road, people had a right to make across around here, I think, because that's a road to be originally. So I think that's what we now have set for part of this determined. As you can see, the avenues that we saw in the painting have gone not no longer at all. We can't really see traces of them. We've got in this area here, and it's a lot of soothing reading, and then it's so with a mixture of grassy and much clover. So it's a bit room down to the water. The pleasure ground down here, and this is the ha-ha coming around here. This was really quite a revolutionary development in the 18th century, and once type small gardens and in the countryside, the effect this created the park just rolled right up to the house. So on the house, you could cut all the bit of amazing cattle, whereas currently just outside it was half of the into the area and sawing it. In the house, the deep park, and was such a revolutionary idea. This was supposed to an extent gardening. It wasn't daily somehow responsible for this change in attitude, but he was a contributor. We got starting, gives a black water provision on, but also something this background started, and he was in the over here. There was magic, and it was because Lady Shelburne wrote about it in the diary. She said that he's sick, and unfortunately subsequently died. Lark's Hill, here, it's possible to me. Originally, it was a street here. Brown was paid to work Lark's Hill, and I'm still not able to work out quite why. Usually, you know a hill, take that again, and move that to one or another. It's critical for you, and the Russians that you come in along the try because they come in here from the and come in right. You use the lake here, you go round the back of Lark's Hill, more lake, and then you pass. Now, lower lake just to something stuff. What you've got is a big flat area on top of the hill now, and it would be quite easy to carry out your house. As no visitors for an appropriate entertainment, and then speak up to table people, and then you wouldn't have to speak down the mountains and speak back at all the house. That's basically the explanation I can think of. I think you'll agree that it's not a good match what we see on Saturday. It's a pretty good match with the plan that's around the 1760s. I see I'm running out of time. I'll go to that one quickly here. In the 1780s, we think this cascade was made at Bowood, and this is really quite significant because it's the only cascade I know. This is all arches built up here and up to here. It's the only I know that is at right angles to the dam. You expect a cascade to sort of come over the dam from the end of the lake, but it doesn't. And it's not very well designed. Now, this kind of landscape that Brown laid out, we've got another example here, which is Benham Park, Berkshire, became known as the English landscape style. The main ingredients were a lake, rolling grassland, a house, apparently in the park with specimen trees, and you might just be able to detect a reflection here. Unfortunately, the wind would when I took this picture, and I couldn't get the reflection. We have the perimeter belts of trees that I mentioned, glimpses of the lake and the house between the trees. The formal garden like Whetham and Longleat were completely out of fashion, and they didn't last. I think you'll probably recognise this. This is Blenheim, and there's another landscape that Brown designed. You've got the palace. You can see the constituent elements of the landscape here. Some lawns, drop water, big area of irregular, informal water, part about, and here, of course, we've got Vanbrugh Bridge. So Dombo designed the bridge, and it was supposed to have an elaborate superstructure on the top, sort of matching architecture of the palace, but it finished. And Brown's genius, of course, was to think of flooding the bridge. It's also quite a tricky bit of water engineering as well. It's easy to think that these landscapes of Brown were totally natural, that he just built a dam and filled the valley up, and that was it. A lot of work on them to make them look this natural. We know what Blenheim looked like before one started working on it because of these two views in 1762. This is from Kent. We've got a semi-geometric lake here, so straight sides but not regular in shape, going into a canal and under Vanbrugh Bridge. Notice the drop we've got here, it's quite steep. And then from the other side, the canal comes out from under the bridge into a round lake here, and then it continues through the park in a series of canals, so geometric, and with dock towers in the background. I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I think that this building looks completely divorced from its landscape. There doesn't seem to be any visual link between the two. This is what we saw first photograph, and this is going back the other way. And here you have reflections. And this phenomenon of having your house reflected in your water was very important in the 18th century. It was the status symbol of the time. And there were lots and lots of engravings made of mansions and landscapes. Almost always should be building the house reflected in water, if it is possible. Portion Court is an example, an engraving of 1779. But the house is too far away from the land, it's not high enough above the lake to be reflected in it, but it still shows as having its reflection. So by 1800, the English landscape style had become universally popular in the country, and the second well, where the formal geometric style of the 14th in France had been so dominant. And so to sum up, many of the places that Brown designed have survived, and played a large part in this revolution in landscape style, which happened in the 18th century, the change from geometric landscapes to natural landscapes. It is true to say that the legacy of Brown and his contemporaries stretches over the centuries, influencing our landscapes even today. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Wendy. Absolutely fascinating. While you were talking, I was actually following a few things on some maps. So particularly Know Your Place, when you see sort of the tithe maps from the 1840s and realising how much had disappeared by then. how much the landscapes have changed. Right, over to everyone for any questions you might have. There was one from Justine, which said, have you looked at LiDAR surveys for the circular area at Whetham, of which there's nothing visible today?
Okay, I haven't. When I was doing that, actually 10 years ago now, I think LiDAR images were available then, and I haven't been back to them.
I took a quick look at reports that Historic England did, and they couldn't. There's not a LiDAR survey on it, but I know they have surveyed. That was an area that Historic England were looking at, particularly around the Roman town of Veluccio. So there may be something on there.
Yeah,
maybe I'll find something.
Yeah.
Now, I had a question, which is that you showed the view of Bowood, and you made the point that what's in them may not be what was actually there. I always wonder how much those paintings were before the landscape designer saying, "This is what it's going to look like. Now give me the contract."
Yes, I think the answer to that is we often don't. I think painting Bowood is probably showing things as they mainly are, partly because there isn't any designer's name linked to that landscape. So I don't think a plan would be used in advance of that 1725 landscape, or it hasn't been anything with it. So my feeling is that there is quite a lot of truth in that thing, especially with the 1763 estate map. Does show quite a lot of those features that are in the painting.
And something else that occurred to me is that seeing, I don't think I'd seen a photo of Wood Cascade before to realise how impressive it is. Is there any chance that the owners of Bowood would have thought, well, there's a cascade going spare at Whetham, I'll have all the stones from it?
Well, who knows? That happened. Obviously, they would have completely reused this, completely used in a completely different way. Because, of course, it's a naturalistic cascade, and yeah. But yes, I don't know where that came from. I suspect that's the one that the experts at Bowood might know the answer to. And I know up in the road, quite near the kiosk where you pay to go into the road, there is I think what was a quarry there. There's certainly a big area with sort of rather muddy water in it. And I always thought that quite a lot of stone came out of that area, but I don't know.
But as you say, it's really unusual for something so significant just disappear completely.
It's not as unusual as I wish it was. I mean, for example, when that big house at Bowood was taken down, there was a big portico at the front of it. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I was startled almost out of my wits to come across that portico on the front of a funeral director's in Cardiff. And there was a plaque on the wall saying that the portico had been bought from Bowood. I mean, it is quite ridiculous. It's quite a big but fairly ordinary sort of house, probably later 18th century or early 19th century, rendered. That's an enormous stone portico, classical stone portico on the front of it. I mentioned this to Lord Lansdowne. He said yes, he knew it was there.
Going cheap from Bowood.
So my point is actually things get moved about quite a lot. The little Doric temple at Bowood, for example, started as the landscape and it's moved lock, stock and barrel across the other side of the lake.
Yeah. Richard has asked, thinking about the labour required to create Brown's Line, was it local or did he have an early army of navvies?
That could vary, I think, according to the landowner, but it would be specified in the contract if the landowner is saying labour. I think Brown provided or recruited the labour force, or his foreman, because he had various foremen, recruited the labour force for him.
So presumably Brown wasn't, or he will have supervised many of the jobs. He presumably wasn't there all the time.
No, he wasn't. No.
So he needed a good team of foremen to supervise work.
Yes, indeed. There's this guy Williams called David Bidman, and it was about other designers Brown, but also it took about his foreman as well, and that's why he started his business.
Tony and Zita, what's the background that focused on the adjacent grounds near Calne? I'm quite sure what that means.
I'm interested in capability grounds landscapes, so also one of those which is near where I live. But that was probably not very historical because it also might be connected with that. Sandy Lane's being people do come across these references in Swiss writings to Whetham and John Calne and Hyde Park, and I think that started well.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, well, unless anyone's any other questions, I think that's probably it. Just wait a moment or two. Now a chance to give a plug for your book, Wendy, and also for the walk on Sunday.
Right. Well, I've written a book called Ornamental Lakes, Their Origins and Evolution in Design Landscapes, and it's very exciting because it arrived today.
Oh.
I got a delivery from the publisher Routledge this morning, which is really exciting, and that was on the back of my PhD 2 years ago. So yeah, that's lovely, and there's a discount code available if anyone wants. And the walk, if it goes ahead on Sunday, will be looking at, still see these aspects of Whetham and Bowood. We can't pass the Whetham land, but we can't actually see much of Whetham. But as you'll see from the Autumn Survey map, there is quite a lot to look at, and the cascade.
Fantastic. So if anyone's interested in joining us, then do the website under events and you can book onto the walk. So with that, a very big thank you, Wendy. Absolutely filled a huge amount, as ever. Thank you to everyone for coming. And if we Sunday, good night.